All right, since this is the first lecture in this section, I'm going to cover real quick what this whole section is about, and that's containers. Containers are the fundamental building block of the Docker toolkit, and that's one of the first things we're going to learn. We're not going to build images or do any advanced stuff until once we've learned what containers are, how to run them, a little bit of how they're different from a VM, and other basic functionality of a container. So the first thing we want to do is make sure that we have the latest version of Docker and it's working. Once we get through that in this lecture, other lectures will talk about how to start containers, how to do manage different aspects of a container, start it, stop it, delete it, create it, that sort of stuff. And we're going to use Nginx for all that. And Nginx is a really basic web server that is going to be easy for us to use just to learn the Docker commands and how to do Docker container stuff. After that, we're going to jump into some networking basics. So you'll learn Docker networking and how the containers talk to each other. And for this whole section, the only real requirement is that you have the latest version of Docker installed and that it's working properly. So in this lecture, we're going to make sure real quick that that's set up correctly. So in order for the Docker command line to work properly, you need to make sure you're in the proper terminal for your operating system. I'm going to be using Mac, so I can use either Terminal or iTerm2, the two popular choices on the Mac. And then on Windows, if you're on Docker for Windows, you'll use PowerShell. If you're on the Docker Toolbox, you'll use the Quick Start terminal that comes with the Docker Toolbox. And if you're on Linux, you'll just use a Linux shell of your choosing. These are all things that I talk about in the previous section for your setup of your operating system. So if you have more questions, just look at those videos. But let's get started. The first command is Docker version. And this command simply returns the version of your client, that's the CLI that we just used, and the server, also called the engine. And the engine is running in the background on your machine. On Windows, it's usually called a service. On Mac and Linux, it's usually called a daemon. And what is happening here is our Docker command line is actually talking to the server on my machine and then returning its values as well as the client values themselves. Ideally, they should be the same, but they don't have to be the same versions. And you want them to be the latest version as possible. If you have an older version like 1.12 or 1.13, you definitely want to make sure that you go to the previous section and get the proper versions installed, because we'll be using a lot of new features that are only in the latest versions. The fact that I did get returned information from the server validates that I can talk to the server and that it's working properly. If you do get an error there, that means maybe you need to do a sudo Docker version if you're maybe on Linux, or possibly your Docker isn't actually running and you maybe need to go to the previous section setup videos to make sure that the Docker is running properly. Now, let's get a little more information out of our Docker engine. If we do a Docker info, it'll return a lot more stuff than just the version. It'll actually give us a lot of the details about our configuration and setup for our engine. Some of these are obvious, like the number of containers you have running, or possibly the number of images you have stored in Docker. But a lot of this other stuff may not make sense now, and that's fine. We're going to go through a lot of it throughout this course. Now, you might be wondering, what are all the commands you can use in Docker? And you can get a list of those by simply just typing Docker and hitting return. You'll see a long list down here at the bottom, and this is not actually the full list, because if you notice up here at the top, we now have this management command. So starting in early 2017, Docker realized that we're getting so many commands down here in this list, where I would just type Docker space and the command, that there were so many of them that they needed to create an easier way to organize all these commands. And that's when they created the management commands. And that creates a format where you have Docker space, the management command, and then the subcommand. So you will see throughout this course that we're trying to use a little bit of both. We mostly will use the new model of Docker. Let's use an example here of container run. And that's the new format of that command. But since the beginning of the Docker project, Docker run has usually been the way that we type that command. It's just recently that the Docker container run has become the new way to run that command. Now, the cool thing about Docker is that it's really focused on backwards compatibility. So the Docker run will probably work forever, but new commands that we get are not going to be using this Docker command value. It will be using Docker space command space subcommand value. So each time I use these commands, we will explain what they are, and I will show you possibly the old way of doing it and the new way of doing it, depending on whether the command has that option. So it'll start to make sense as we go through this course. Okay, even though we had a very short lecture and it was pretty simple, let's just review real quick those commands. The Docker version command is the one I always use first on a new Docker system, just to make sure that my client can talk to the engine and that I'm running the version that I would expect. Secondly, Docker info gives me a lot of the configuration values out of the engine just to make sure that it's set up the way that I expect. And lastly, we talked about the command line structure. The old way still works. So for older commands that have been around for the last 4+ years, they still work with Docker command and then the options. But for new commands going forward, Docker is creating a new model of the management commands with Docker space command space subcommand. And the example we used was Docker run, one of the most common commands you use in Docker, where the old way was Docker run, but the new way of Docker container run also works. And you can decide how you want to use those commands, whether you want to use the old way or the new way, because they both will still work.